Personne ne peut dire.
No one,
Dans le monde.
no one in the world,
Et en particulier,
and in
personne en
particular,
Amérique ne peut dire.
no one in America
Si,
can say if,
où,
where,
quand,
when,
comment, dans
how,
quelle mesure
or to what extent
les armements nucléaires
America's nuclear
américains
forces would be used
seraient employés
to defend Europe.
à défendre l'Europe.
Charles de Gaulle became a key figure in bringing the bomb to Europe. A new chapter in the nuclear age. This is a ballistic missile site high up on the central plateau of France, one of 18 missile sites in the French nuclear force. Today, France is the third largest nuclear power in the world, and it runs its forces independently of other Western nations. France's triad of land, air, and sea forces will soon boast more than 1,000 nuclear warheads, aimed, French leaders have said, in all directions.
Commande bonne. Capteur correct. Voyant actif. Test correct.
The most powerful leg of the French forces is its ballistic missile submarines. By the 1990s, they will be capable of delivering 500 warheads to any point on the globe. The French weapons and their British counterparts complicate arms control talks and fit uneasily into the equation of East-West relations.
3. Montez l'arme jusqu'au repère 6.
This program tells the story of the growth of the French and other nuclear arsenals in Europe. The story of the arming of a continent.
Today is Victory in Europe Day.
Alone amongst the victors over Nazi Germany, Great Britain had fought from the first day of the war until the last. No one yet spoke of the two superpowers. This was the age of the Big Three.
Mr. Churchill flew back from Potsdam with his daughter Mary on what was to be almost his last day as Prime Minister. Out of the election melting pot comes his successor.
On the very day of his election, Clement Attlee learned of the existence of the atom bomb. 10 days earlier in the New Mexico desert, British scientists had helped prepare the Trinity test. They, and not the Americans, had first confirmed the feasibility of a nuclear weapon. Britain was an active partner in the Manhattan Project, which culminated in Hiroshima and Nagasaki.
There was a strong desire on the British side for that collaboration to continue into peacetime. There was no such desire on the part of the United States.
A special Senate Committee on Atomic Energy heard arguments against continued Anglo-American cooperation on atomic research. The Americans feared that the alliance with Britain threatened secrecy and challenged America's monopoly over atomic developments.
Future activity in this field is so important to the national welfare and potentially...
Opposed to nuclear sharing was General Leslie Groves, commander of the Manhattan Project. So too was most of Congress.
The large number of Americans, particularly in the Congress, felt that atomic energy was an American secret which could be kept, a monopoly which should be preserved, and therefore that no information of any kind should be given in relation to this project to any other country, including the United Kingdom.
In July 1946, Congress sent the Atomic Energy Act to President Truman for signature. Britain was on her own. For Clement Attlee and his foreign minister, Ernest Bevin, Congress's decision was more than a disappointment. The British feared it was a sign that America might turn again to isolationism. If that happened, Britain would be left alone to police a war-ravaged Germany and to organize the defense of an exhausted Europe. Elsewhere in the world, Britain's colonies and protectorates placed heavy demands on its military manpower. The atom bomb seemed indispensable.
The fact that a major power should not have a nuclear weapon seemed, in those early days, unthinkable. These were the weapons of the future.
The Prime Minister and Ernest Bevin were quite determined that this was something that had to be done, and they arranged that it should be done.
Outside the village of Harwell, the British built their first atomic reactor. Public and Parliament were told that it was for peaceful purposes.
It's already done useful service for about a year, producing radioactive materials for medical research.
Not even the full cabinet knew its true purpose, to produce plutonium for a bomb. Only when Winston Churchill returned to power in 1951 did the public learn the full truth. His socialist predecessors, Churchill announced, had secretly brought Britain to the brink of success. In October 1952, on the islands of Montebello off the desolate northwest coast of Australia, Britain became the world's third nuclear power.
Slowly, the seconds tick away. To Dr. Penny and his team, great credit is due for this mighty British achievement. The spectacular success of the operation furthers our hopes of peace, for it seems that by the possession of such deadly weapons, peace can be maintained in this troubled world.
For France, however, there was little peace in the 1950s. In Vietnam, in the valley of Dien Bien Phu, her army was crushingly defeated by the communist forces of Ho Chi Minh. The morale of the French army, the prestige of the French nation, had never recovered from defeat in World War II. Now, to many Frenchmen, Britain's example pointed the only way forward. But France's political leaders disagreed. The socialist leader Pierre Mendès France was typical. He was more interested in world disarmament than in building a French atom bomb. As Prime Minister of France, he appealed in the United Nations for an immediate halt to atomic tests.
C'est notre espoir de voir les ressources prodigieuses du génie humain.
But his appeals went unheeded. By the time he returned to Paris, Mendès France had undergone a dramatic conversion. He summoned a meeting of his top scientific advisors. One of them was nuclear scientist Bertrand Goldschmidt.
And he had about half a dozen or more speaking against the bomb and half a dozen speaking in favor. And then he said it's very clear. We are nothing in international relations without the bomb. If we want to have an influence on disarmament, we should have the bomb.
2 years later, in the Suez Canal, France suffered another humiliation. It strengthened still further the determination to build a French bomb. In 1956, the charismatic new socialist leader of Egypt, Gamal Abdel Nasser, nationalized the canal, which was jointly owned by Britain and France. They saw Nasser as a dangerous Soviet-backed fanatic. In consort with Israel, Britain and France resorted to force. Both superpowers reacted with hostility to the Anglo-French invasion of Egypt. President Eisenhower felt he had been deceived by his allies.
The United States was not consulted in any way about any phase of these actions, nor were we informed of them in advance. It is our hope
Eisenhower brought enormous financial pressure on Britain, and determined to stop the fighting, he dispatched the United States Sixth Fleet to Egypt. A future foreign minister of France watched the fleet arrive off Port Said.
At least we expected that America could have been neutral. But when we saw the American fleet just off the Egyptian shores, the French people resented more bitterly than you can imagine.
Reluctantly, the British ordered a ceasefire. The French could only follow. As their forces ignominiously pulled out of Egypt, it seemed to them that the superpowers had combined against them.
That had a very profound, very deep impact on the French mentality. For the first time, a crack in the alliance was visible.
Pierre Gallois of the French Air Force had been lobbying for years for a French atom bomb. Suez, he believes, was the crucial turning point.
And during the budgetary debates in December '56, the whole assembly, excluding the communists, were in favor of French having atomic weapons.
Suez affected Britain's nuclear ambitions too. The invasion divided the country. The conservative government found itself condemned by world opinion and attacked at home. Worst of all, it felt it had been betrayed by the United States.
The reaction was one of great bitterness at the time, but it was followed very quickly by a feeling that as soon as possible the relationship must be repaired.
No one was more committed to the American alliance than new Prime Minister Harold Macmillan.
I've known General Eisenhower, as I call him then, President Eisenhower, since the days of the war. We had a lot of very tough problems to deal with then, and we made great friends.
In March of 1957, on the island of Bermuda, the two old friends restored their country's special relationship.
I'm sure that in the next few days, we can do much to strengthen the long-term bonds that have bound together the British Empire and my country.
Macmillan would try to maintain a delicate balance. He wanted Britain to be America's closest ally, and yet to stay an independent great power.
But true partnership is based upon respect. We don't intend to part from the Americans, and we don't intend to be satellites. I'm sure they wouldn't want us to be. The stronger we are, the better partners we shall be.
Macmillan believed that an independent nuclear force was more vital than ever, and that it still made military sense. In the era of the hydrogen bomb, vastly more powerful than the simple atom bomb, a medium-sized power like Britain could threaten devastating damage even to a superpower. In May 1957, only 2 years after the Soviet Union, Britain detonated its first H-bomb over Christmas Island. It was equivalent to 1 million tons of TNT, nearly 70 Hiroshimas.
Don't you hear the H-bomb's thunder echo like the crack of doom? While they rend the skies asunder, fallout may
I never bothered to demonstrate before, but the H-bomb is more serious than the other.
Well, because we think it's the proper thing to do, and it's the only way.
Do you think they're right in wanting to ban the H-bomb?
I think they're very right in wanting to ban the H-bomb.
The world in ruin, only you can make the choice. Stop and think of what you're doing. Join the march and raise your voice.
For the first time in the nuclear age, a popular movement of protest arose. In 1958, the Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament staged the first of many Easter marches between London and the Atomic Weapons Research Establishment in the village of Aldermaston.
I think it was a gut reaction. It was an increasing realization that things were going on in a way which ordinary people were incapable of appreciating, and there was, I can put it in this way. I sat down with a number of other people at the gates of Aldermaston, and my clear recollection was of the vast gap between what was going on outside in the world and what was going on inside in Aldermaston.
A few months later, American Thor missiles arrived in Britain to be targeted on the Soviet Union. Just as it would 20 years later, when the cruise missiles arrived, British opposition to nuclear weapons became fused with opposition to the American alliance itself.
If you are the boss, you give the orders. If you are the junior partner, you take the orders. And I think that a great many people had an increasing sense that we were no longer the boss, that we were in fact a junior partner with England as an available aircraft carrier on behalf of the United States located off the coast of Europe.
But in Britain in the 1950s, such views were held by a minority. With Eisenhower as president, the American alliance was immensely popular.
No one from overseas was Britain ever more pleased to see. For 15 years, this man has been a friend in war and peace.
Eisenhower had succeeded in persuading Congress to amend the Atomic Energy Act to allow a full atomic partnership with Britain. America's other allies were pointedly excluded. In Harold Macmillan's view, this special treatment could only be due to Britain's development of its own H-bomb. That in itself made the H-bomb worthwhile.
It gives us a better position in the world, it gives us a better position with the United States, and it puts us where we ought to be, in a position of a great power.
Now, you say it gives us a better position, but can you imagine any situation in which we would use our H-bomb alone?
I hope I can imagine no situation we should have to use it at all. But I say the fact that we are a nuclear power helps us with the United States and makes them pay greater regard to our point of view, and that's of great importance in my view.
For Harold Macmillan, the bomb was a way to bind Britain and America more closely together. For France, going nuclear would have the opposite effect. Algiers, May 1958. France's long and bitter war against Algerian nationalists had descended into chaos and stalemate. The army was in open mutiny against the central government. In Paris, that government was helpless as demonstrations and riots brought the capital to a standstill. Only Charles de Gaulle offered new hope. He had salvaged French honor after the defeat of 1940. Now, on the brink of civil war, France had turned to him again. De Gaulle's first priority was to restore French morale and French prestige. France must once again take her place in the ranks of the great nations, and to do that, he argued, she needed the atomic bomb.
General de Gaulle had a vision of the greatness of France. and especially of her armed forces, because he'd been a military man all his life. And he thought that since great nations like the United States, the Soviet Union, Great Britain, had nuclear weapons, there was no reason why France shouldn't have them too. This was more political than military, but I believe it was the most important of his ideas.
Within weeks, de Gaulle was touring France's atomic plants. He discovered that he would not have to wait long. The previous prime minister had ordered the Atomic Energy Commission to test a bomb by the summer of 1960. De Gaulle had merely to confirm the instruction, but he differed radically from his socialist predecessor in the use to which he intended to put the bomb once it was built.
The idea of the socialist prime minister was to develop an atomic weapon in France and to give such an atomic force to the pool of European nations to increase the strength of European defense, not at all on a national basis. General de Gaulle transformed it into the weapon of a nation.
There are two groups in the world, the Anglo-Saxons and the Soviets, who for years have been building and stockpiling atomic weapons. France will not accept a position of permanent and massive inferiority.
At Regan, deep in the Sahara, France goes forward with the detonation of her first atomic bomb, defying a United Nations resolution and the disapproval of both America and the Soviet.
The reaction of the superpowers was hostile. Between them, they now had enough nuclear weapons to destroy the Northern Hemisphere. In both Moscow and Washington, the nuclear ambitions of smaller powers seemed vainglorious, unnecessary, and dangerous.
In our view, the French created their nuclear potential not in order to withstand the Soviet threat, but merely as a consequence of de Gaulle's and other French leaders' ideas regarding the general status of France in the world.
I think I understood the importance of a nuclear deterrent for British pride, for French pride, but that it seemed to me that we were in a world that was sufficiently dangerous that national pride was should be secondary and not primary. We had a common problem of security.
In Washington, a new administration brought with it a new confidence. President Kennedy and his advisors believed that America should bear sole responsibility for the nuclear defense of the West. Not all his allies agreed.
No one in the world, and in particular, no one in America, can say if, where, when, how, or to what extent America's nuclear forces would be used to defend Europe.
I remember de Gaulle telling me the French atomic bomb, as the English atomic bomb, may prove to be a necessary trigger.
De Gaulle doubted that the Americans would use their strategic forces in response to a Soviet attack in Europe. But if France fired first, the United States would have to join in. Such thinking horrified Kennedy's Secretary of Defense.
And thirdly, it's been argued that nuclear capabilities
At a university commencement address, Robert McNamara made a scathing public attack on France's nuclear ambition.
limited nuclear capabilities operating independently are dangerous, expensive, prone to obsolescence, and lacking in credibility as a deterrent.
It was more a statement, perhaps, than a message. And it was a statement for which I was severely criticized at the time. And as a matter of fact, it's a statement the French haven't forgotten to this day.
Robert McNamara ne croyait pas que nous continuerions.
Robert McNamara didn't believe that we would carry on. He thought that after de Gaulle, France would give up its nuclear force.
But de Gaulle was not alone in his belief that France should not rely on the Americans.
A great nation should have its own strike force.
We must have a national strike force for our defense.
We are not an American colony, sir. Understand?
France's nuclear force was still in its infancy. Britain's was at the height of its strength. 140 fast, modern bombers could destroy most of Russia's cities on their own. But the British knew that this huge investment would soon be obsolete. In the age of the missile, the manned bomber was vulnerable. The Soviet Union was building around its borders a ring of modern surface-to-air missiles. To penetrate this barrier, the British were relying on American help.
The logical answer is the air-launched ballistic missile, Skybolt. The British government is integrating Skybolt with the high-performance Vulcan Mark II RAF bomber, which carries 2 of the air-launched ballistic missiles.
But Skybolt failed to live up to the promise of its designers.
In Washington, before leaving to meet Mr. McMillan, President Kennedy told a press conference why he wishes to stop the manufacture of Skybolt.
The problem with Skybolt is it's the most sophisticated weapon imaginable. We put $500 million into it already. To fire a missile from a plane moving at high speed to hit a target 1,000 miles away has been really, in a sense, kind of engineering that's been beyond us.
As the news broke of Skybolt's impending cancellation, Harold Macmillan was on his way to meet Kennedy in the Bahamas. He had pinned his reputation on his ability to maintain an independent nuclear force for Britain. Now his whole political future was on the line. At Nassau, Macmillan told Kennedy that if they could not have Skybolt, the British must be allowed the submarine-launched Polaris missile instead. But Kennedy's advisors urged him to refuse.
I was opposed to providing Polaris to the British. I was anxious to get the British to abandon the business. Then we would have some possibility of getting the French to do the same thing.
But once again, politics and personality were to prevail over grand strategy.
Macmillan was a kind of avuncular figure as far as Kennedy was concerned. In any event, before we had been there very long, Macmillan had put his case to Kennedy so persuasively, as one politician in trouble to another, that Kennedy made up his mind, and so the deal was done.
I would like to pay tribute to the statesmanship of President Kennedy and his advisors, who, after much thought and discussion, and I think I may be perhaps right in saying some pressure from us, accepted what we felt was the right balance within the alliance.
Macmillan had good reason to be pleased. Within 6 years, Britain launched the first of 4 Polaris missile submarines. The boats and the warheads were British. The missiles were bought from America at bargain basement prices.
Right. Action stations. Set condition 1 SQ.
Thanks to the Americans, who had openly opposed the French nuclear force, the life of the British deterrent was extended for 20 years.
Missile away.
Belatedly, President Kennedy wrote a letter to de Gaulle to offer him the same deal he had given the British. But the answer from Paris was blunt.
It wouldn't really be useful for us to buy Polaris missiles, since we have neither the submarines from which to launch them, nor the warheads with which to arm them. We will stand by our decision to build, and if all else fails, to use our atomic forces ourselves.
5 years later, in August 1968, France became the fifth and so far the last nation to explode a hydrogen bomb in the atmosphere. General de Gaulle watched the test from a French warship in the Pacific.
Sa première réaction en voyant ce champignon.
His first reaction watching the mushroom cloud rise up high into the atmosphere was to say, "It's magnificent." In reality, what he found magnificent was our success, a symbol, as it were, of French military might.
For Britain and France, nuclear weapons were more than a guarantee of national security. They were a substitute for empire, a symbol of international standing in an age when the real power had passed on. There was a third large and populous nation in Western Europe. But unlike Britain and France, Germany did not aspire to the status of great power. Those ambitions lay buried in the rubble of the Third Reich. Out of disgrace and defeat came a new democratic state. West Germany would never possess its own nuclear weapons, but it would become host to thousands of American warheads. There were many reasons, but one outweighed all others: the fear of the threat from the East. Each October in Red Square, the Soviet armed forces display their strength. From the immediate post-war years right up to the present day, the West has believed that it cannot match the Red Army by conventional means. Right or wrong, that conviction led directly to a rearmed West Germany, bristling with nuclear weapons.
We strongly felt that European conventional forces were too weak to defend Western Europe against the very strong conventional forces of the Soviet Union and the Warsaw Pact. And therefore, we needed the nuclear weapons, and we needed early use of nuclear weapons.
September 1951. For the third time in half a century, American troops arrived in Europe. The NATO treaty had promised American military support, and a weak and fearful Europe welcomed their arrival. The number sent was small, but the troops were above all symbolic of American resolve.
The American troops were basically seen as guaranteeing American nuclear retaliation if the Red Army moved west. And at that time, all the Red Army needed to reach the Rhine was boots.
In Germany, the British Army of the Rhine begins its 10-day autumn maneuvers, part of a huge combined operation watched by General Eisenhower.
That same year, Dwight Eisenhower was made commander of the military forces of NATO. Under his command were just 12 ill-equipped divisions from a dozen nations. His staff insisted that to stop the Red Army, he needed not 12 divisions, but 90. Such forces, Eisenhower soon realized, were a political impossibility.
And that left a situation in which some of our top leaders, including General Eisenhower, perceived that it was the beginning of the end of NATO.
Air Force Colonel John Richardson was on the NATO planning staff in Paris.
Unless the military came up with a method of doing the business, a strategy and a method of resisting, namely Soviet aggression, that was affordable and did not depend upon mass. And what did they do? They used the technology where we had the advantage at that time, tactical nuclear weapons.
Nevada, USA. This is the valley where the giant mushrooms grow.
America's nuclear engineers were testing a whole new generation of atomic weapons. Their explosive power was as great as the bombs which had been dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. But these were considered to be battlefield weapons. They could be delivered by fighter bombers, by short-range missiles. They could even be fired from a cannon. The Americans had decided that these tactical nuclear weapons were an inexpensive answer to the Red Army's advantage in manpower.
We didn't have at that time the capability to fight effectively with nuclear weapons. We didn't even know how we would go about doing it very well. But that didn't matter, because no one knew we didn't, least of all the Russians, who, regardless of their superiority, were then forced to go back and take 10 or 20 years to figure out how to cope with this new technology and this new threat, and we bought 20 years of deterrence.
Soon, the United States Tactical Air Force in Europe was heavily armed with nuclear weapons. And the U.S. Army's atomic cannon were lumbering through European villages. America supplied the firepower, but wanted Europe to provide the manpower. So, to the consternation of their allies, the Americans insisted that the old enemy, West Germany, must be rearmed.
We are still not strong enough to be certain of resisting successfully an all-out act of aggression. We need greater strength. And that is one of the reasons why we at this headquarters have always advocated a German contribution.
The French Parliament and French public opinion were not ready to accept a German national army. The revival of a German army reminded the French people of too much and of too recent recollections.
After 2 years of argument, Britain's Anthony Eden chaired a conference in London where a compromise was reached. The West German army would be under NATO command. A solemn undertaking by Chancellor Adenauer had at last persuaded the French. West Germany, he promised, would never produce nuclear weapons on its soil.
It was a crucial point when he renounced the atomic bomb. There was virtually a majority in the French Parliament to accept Germany in NATO.
The new German army is born after years of bitter argument. At Andernach near Bonn, the first 2,000 recruits have arrived and are drawing their uniforms from the quartermaster stores. No, it isn't square. Like it or not, the Wehrmacht is with us again.
The Soviet Union did not like it. A week after the admission of Germany into NATO, 6 years after the formation of NATO itself, the Warsaw Pact was signed. In the West, it was dismissed as a propaganda move, Soviet client states aping the free democracies. But the Russian fear of a new German army was genuine enough.
Germany, during not one, but two, even three generations, determined Russia's fate. In World War I and in World War II, Germans intruded on our territory. They not only burned and looted our cities, they killed civilians as well as soldiers. In World War II, we lost 20 million Soviet people.
И по существу война до сих пор в каждом из нас.
But the German people would be the first to suffer if ever war broke out again in Europe. Just a month after West Germany joined NATO, Exercise Carte Blanche was staged by its British and American allies in the skies above its territory. More than 300 atomic strikes were rehearsed in a single week. The object was to defend the West against Soviet attack. But if the bombs had been real, they would have killed or injured more than 3 million West German civilians.
Large parts of the population who heard for the first time in their life something about nuclear weapons, nuclear war, were deeply depressed that every day hundreds of these weapons were exploded on German territory, and the war went on, went on, went on.
A 100,000 British, French, and Americans mass for Exercise Cordon Bleu. They throw powerful weapons into the mock battle, using Honest John rockets and the 280mm atomic cannon. Heavy use is made of atomic weapons, and it is clear that they are here to stay.
We'd just gotten these nuclear weapons, and we were not very far along on how to use this tremendous increase in firepower. You might say we were comparable in terms of using weapons in those days to what it might be like handing a hand grenade to a caveman.
They were accepted as being perfectly reasonable weapons to use in a tactical battle in continental Europe. I mean, the fact it would have devastated quite a large part of Germany had to be accepted.
Chancellor Adenauer and his generals thought otherwise. They believed that a strong German army in NATO would make its nuclear strategy unnecessary. They pushed hard for a return to conventional defense. Events in Hungary soon changed their minds.
Hated emblems of red tyranny went down as Hungarian patriots pitted raw courage and rifles against tanks. But the heady breath of freedom was...
The November 1956 Hungarian attempt to establish democracy and to withdraw from the Warsaw Pact was brutally crushed by the Red Army. Soviet ruthlessness made a deep impression in West Germany.
Free world beckoned.
When the Soviets marched in to Hungary, people said it's absolutely necessary to defend against these damned bad Soviets.
In the new climate, West Germany appointed a new defense minister, Franz Josef Strauss. He was a fervent anti-communist and a convert to the American strategy of nuclear deterrence. If war came, he warned the German army, it would be nuclear, and millions of Germans would be its victims. But the more terrible the threat that nuclear weapons posed, the better the hope that war would never come.
War should be considered upon to be, should be looked upon to be as terrible as our fantasy can imagine it. And I think then we shall have a more peaceful period in the next 100 years than we had in the last century.
But many Europeans still saw no need to have nuclear weapons on their own soil. Why not rely for deterrence on America's long-range bombers, which could respond to any Soviet aggression in Europe by flattening the Russian homeland from the air? That argument was severely challenged in the fall of 1957. In quick succession, the Soviet Union launched the world's first 2 satellites. The second was big enough to carry a dog into space.
The existence of these 2 satellites and their orbits constitutes the gravest military threat that we have ever had to face, because it means that instead of a dog, it may be possible to deliver a bomb. A megaton hydrogen bomb at a predetermined point on the surface of this globe.
America was now vulnerable to nuclear attack in its turn. For the first time, Europeans began to ask themselves the question that has troubled them ever since. Is it really credible that any American president would sacrifice New York to save Hamburg?
The basic question was, can we trust in the long run to the American deterrence alone? Or would it necessary to develop also on the European soil a deterrence?
A month after the launch of Sputnik 2, President Eisenhower arrived at NATO headquarters in Paris to try to reassure his shaken allies.
Paris hasn't seen such an imposing gathering of Western leaders since the peace conference of 1919. But the most important purpose, probably, of this conference is to jack up the morale of the West.
We are here to rededicate ourselves to the task of dispelling the shadows that are being cast upon the free world. The Soviet state daily increases its military and economic power, and its rulers make clear their purpose to use that power to dominate the world.
But the Europeans, and especially the Germans, wanted more than a pep talk. Unlike their allies, they could never develop nuclear weapons of their own. But at least they wanted more say in NATO's nuclear strategy. They pointed out that even the tactical nuclear weapons stationed in Germany itself were owned, manned, and targeted exclusively by the United States. In an effort to satisfy their allies, the Americans agreed to share this monopoly. The decision was to prove a turning point. American warheads would be stockpiled on the continent. European armies and air forces, including the German Bundeswehr, would buy the missiles and the aircraft capable of using them. In time of war, the president would release the warheads, and all of Europe would be nuclear armed. From this point on, European governments were irrevocably committed to a nuclear defense. Ironically, it was a development which, within a few years, the United States would come to regret.
5, 4, 3, 2, 1, fire!
In 1960, the Americans had on their side more than 6,000 nuclear weapons, while the Soviets had less than 300. That was the ratio in 1960, not to mention the 1950s, when the ratio was even more favorable to the Americans.
But the Soviets were catching up. By the late 1950s, the Soviet Union was deploying hundreds of enormous rockets which could deliver an H-bomb anywhere in Europe. American military planners realized that in time, the Soviets would match the West in battlefield weapons too. And they began to worry.
Whereas in the 50s, it would not be too difficult for a decision maker to say, if the Russians attack across Europe, we'll respond with nuclear weapons and we'll wipe out their greater numbers of forces with weapons. but in the forthcoming 60s and 70s, if the Soviets were to attack, and we responded with nukes and they responded to us, they might wipe us out as well as they, and it would just be a disaster.
Before he left office, Eisenhower had developed similar doubts. Tactical nuclear weapons had seemed a good idea when the enemy could not fire back. But they looked less sensible now that the Soviets were developing comparable arsenals. Yet still, they continued to be built.
He began to ask, how many of these things are we building, and what are we building them for? And he didn't get very good answers, and he was increasingly dissatisfied with recommendations to continue to produce and to deploy these when he saw no real logical or rational kind of calculation on which those numbers were based.
By the early 60s, these doubts had grown stronger still. Americans realized that any one of West Germany's hundreds of starfighters armed with American nuclear weapons could start an exchange which might end within hours in the total destruction of both superpowers. To the Americans, that made nuclear weapons in Europe deadly dangerous. But to the Europeans, it made them a highly effective deterrent.
From that point on, it was the Americans who did not want to get involved in the use of nuclear weapons. And it's the Europeans who wanted to, because they reckoned that nothing but a threat to the Soviet homeland would deter the Soviet Union. They were not liable to be deterred just by the cost of fighting a conventional war in West Germany. So it was the Europeans that wanted the nuclear weapons. And ever since then, the position has been the same.
10 years earlier, the Americans had introduced tactical nuclear weapons to Europe. The Germans had resisted. Now the positions were reversed. For the next 20 years, American supreme commanders would try to get European nations to rely more on conventional armaments and less on the first and early use of nuclear weapons. They have not had much success.
There is an unacceptable risk of nuclear war today because NATO commanders will say today, and have said publicly, that they would expect in the early hours of any military confrontation between East and West to request authority to use nuclear weapons. I think that's a disgraceful state of affairs.
How will you have a safer place than the place which had peace since 40 years? One of the longest peace periods in Europe. I believe what we did, nobody knows if it was totally right or totally wrong, but I would say with Winston Churchill, I think it's clear that we did not make everything wrong.
Whatever their role in keeping the peace, nuclear weapons proved to be divisive for NATO. In 1966, General de Gaulle took France out of the alliance and ordered all of NATO's military installations and troops out of France. From this point on, France would depend on her own nuclear force. The soldiers and politicians of NATO presided over an enormous buildup of nuclear weapons in Europe. It was due to national pride as much as military strategy, rivalry in the West as much as the threat from the East. Whether Europeans are safer as a result, neither they nor the people who govern them have yet been able to say.